The question of where exactly Christopher Columbus first set foot in the New World has puzzled historians for centuries, with the traditionally accepted Bahamian site now challenged by compelling evidence pointing to Grand Turk. In Chapter 2, I follow Columbus, find Grand Turk's ghosts. We explore how this seemingly academic debate reveals a darker truth about the complete annihilation of the Lucayan Taíno people, whose islands remained empty for over 150 years after systematic slave raids wiped them from existence. What begins as a Caribbean vacation musing about historical geography becomes a haunting encounter with the consequences of Columbus's transformation from explorer to colonizer. I follow Columbus, find Grand Turk's ghosts. Ocean's Odyssey, Skeptics, Smugglers, and Sails. With the great campaign of dedicated relaxation entering its most critical phase, I established a forward command post on a well-situated beach chair at Grace Bay. The war against ambition is hard fought, requiring a singularity of purpose usually reserved for monks or toddlers, and my objective was simply to exist. All around me, the thermal lobsters, tourists whose primary tactical strategy involved turning a violent shade of crimson, scurried about their business. They resembled crustaceans realizing too late that their spa day was double booked with a rolling boil, yet they persisted in their solar exposure with frightening determination. I observed several 50-year-old women, tanned and sporting abdominal muscles that looked carved from mahogany, and assumed they hailed from New York, a culture roughly as alien to my current state of inertia as the surface of Mars. For a moment my resolve to remain motionless wavered. A fleeting, romantic notion of riding a horse along the surf flickered in the back of my mind, a scene ripped straight from a cologne advertisement where the model remains miraculously dry despite the ocean spray. The vision was noble. The reality, however, arrived with the blunt force of a tax audit. I pictured myself attempting to mount a large, sweating animal in 90-degree humidity, its hide radiating heat like a biological blast furnace. Ideally, equestrianism is a communion between man and steed on a windswept shore. Practically, it is an unwilling participation in a damp, malodorous event involving 1,000 pounds of unstable muscle. That mental portrait successfully crushed my ambitions, and I sank deeper into the upholstery, victorious in my renewed commitment to doing absolutely nothing. Staring at the endless blue horizon from the safety of the shade, one begins to understand how men develop grand, dangerous ideas. The Turks and Caicos Tourism Authority is fond of one such notion, claiming that Christopher Columbus, on his 1492 tour of the Western Hemisphere, made his first pit stop here rather than in the Bahamas. This assertion seems to have originated in an era before historical figures were subjected to the same rigorous performance reviews as middle managers, a simpler time when owning a T-shirt that read, "Columbus discovered America," was a point of civic pride rather than a potential human resources incident. Before the admiral of the ocean sea could become a geopolitical lightning rod, he first had to acquire his ships. A story that proves grand history often runs on the same petty fuel as a homeowners association dispute. Columbus arrived in the port of Palos de la Frontera, waving a royal decree from Ferdinand and Isabella with great self-importance. The local sailors viewed his plan to sail west across the Sea of Darkness as a suicidal folly. They refused to invest their lives in invisible real estate, and the entire venture teetered on the verge of collapse for lack of a crew. The Spanish crown, however, possessed a bureaucratic ace up its velvet sleeve. Ferdinand and Isabella had just concluded a long, fantastically expensive war to retake Granada, and their royal coffers echoed. They had the will to fund Columbus, but not the wallet. Conveniently, the town of Palos owed the monarchy a favor as punishment for a past civic offense. This was not a dramatic act of rebellion, but something much smaller and more human. The fishermen of Palos had a long-standing, profitable habit of illegal fishing and slaving in Portuguese waters, a direct violation of the Treaty of Alcazovas. For years, they had been a royal nuisance, dodging taxes with casual smuggling. Consequently, as penance for their creative interpretation of maritime boundaries, the town was ordered to provide and crew 2 ships for the man with the wild idea. The Pinta and the Niña were not staffed by brave volunteers yearning for glory. They were supplied by disgruntled fishermen community servicing their way out of a smuggling fine. The Spanish monarchy effectively punished a town, fulfilled a contract, and launched a world-changing voyage without spending a single maravidi. Columbus's landfall, Pinta, Palos, and San Salvador. The plea deal was signed, and the town of Palos owed the crown 2 caravels, but paperwork is poor ballast. Royal orders can requisition hulls, yet they are notoriously ineffective at manufacturing enthusiasm. The expedition stalled in classic bureaucratic fashion. Every legal requirement was technically satisfied, yet nothing actually moved. No one was eager to decide which local families would shoulder the risk of sailing west with an unknown Genoese observer for a captain. The Spanish crown, you see, did not benevolently grant ships so much as issue a reminder. This was when Martin Alonso Pinzón entered the scene, not as a dreamer, but as a fixer. A wealthy shipowner and local navigator, he did what the royal decrees could not. He committed vessels under his own control, put up his own money, and, most critically, persuaded the terrified sailors of Palos to sign on. The Spanish crown may have demanded the ships, but Pinzón was the one who ensured they had captains, crews, and a reason to leave the dock. It reads less like a triumph of visionary belief and more like a restrained business intervention. Pinzón saw a reckless venture that offered acceptable odds and organized it accordingly, eventually placing his own brothers in command roles. One can almost hear him gathering his kin and muttering, "Fine, we'll do it properly." Once the Pinta, Niña, and Santa Maria finally cleared the harbor, they discovered little more than the various moods of water. After months of this, with rations shrinking and tempers flaring, crew morale thinned to a dangerous transparency. To keep everyone pointed west, Columbus offered the 15th century equivalent of a retention bonus, a silk doublet, and a lifetime pension for the first man to sight land. On the evening of October 11th, the ocean finally changed its character. The swells grew heavily rhythmic, hinting at resistance from a nearby shore. The crew began harvesting clues from the water, a green reed, a carved stick, a small branch bobbing with fresh rose hips. This was not the usual mockery of drifting weeds. It was a termination notice for the open sea. As night fell, capture took priority over navigation. Columbus, standing high on the stern castle, claimed he saw a flicker of light, like a little wax candle. It was an impressively convenient sighting, reported by the one man with the most to gain and no witnesses to contradict him. The real moment arrived hours later. At 2 in the morning, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, posted in the rigging of Pinzón's Pinta, spotted the pale line of shore in the moonlight and shouted the 2 finest words in the Spanish language, "Tierra! Tierra!" The ships hove to and waited for dawn. In the morning light, a low green island emerged, ringed by a great reef and sheltering a broad lagoon at its center, a description that fits Grand Turk with unnerving precision. From the trees, the island's inhabitants, the Lucayan Taíno, watched these floating hills and their pale occupants drift toward the beach. Columbus, of course, later claimed the pension and the silk doublet for himself, insisting his phantom light counted as the first sighting. I sometimes wonder what Rodrigo de Triana thought, watching his supervisor collect a reward for a race the sailor had unmistakably won. It raises a question that ghosts across the centuries. Was that the first bonus ever stolen by management in the New World? Guanahani's ground, Grand Turk's Great Guess. As the sun beat down, turning the air into a thick, breathable soup, I looked out at the waters where Christopher Columbus allegedly first stumbled ashore. Standing in the heat, I tried to superimpose the mental image of those 3 ships dropping anchor just beyond the reef, the exhausted crew finally confirming that the ocean had an end. You would think, given the existence of a national park and a monument, that the location was settled fact. But history, like a stubborn houseguest, rarely leaves just because you want it to. The furious argument over where Columbus actually landed exists for one simple reason. The dog ate his homework. The original logbook, the single most important document of the voyage, vanished centuries ago. We are left with a summary written by a friar, Bartolomé de las Casas, which is the historical equivalent of trying to reconstruct a legendary rock concert based on one sober roadie's memoir. This gaping hole in the record created a vacuum into which nearly every island with a beach and a palm tree has tried to insert itself. It is less a historical debate and more a geographical brawl. For centuries, the heavyweight champion of landfall claims was Watling Island in the Bahamas, which was so confident in its status that it had itself renamed San Salvador in 1926. Its primary evidence was largely inertia. Everyone just sort of agreed it was the right place, grandfathers teaching grandsons, until it hardened into truth. Then came Samana Cay, another Bahamian contender that became the academic darling of the 1980s after National Geographic showed up with computers, a profoundly modern way to solve a 15th century problem. Its star has since faded, barely a blip on the radar. This brings us to Grand Turk, the challenger that came to the fight with a highlighted copy of the script. The intellectual quest to pinpoint a single patch of sand feels a bit like the search for the Holy Grail, another historical object whose legend has long since outstripped the evidence. But here, the clues are oddly compelling. Columbus described an island that was very flat and roughly bean-shaped, encircled by a great reef with a large lagoon in the middle. Standing there, you can tick them off a list. The island is flatter than a line in a geometry textbook. The reef creates a distinct break line in the blue, and the central lagoon system is the island's defining feature. The final damning piece of evidence is a unique shelf on the seafloor just offshore, a sudden shallowing of the Atlantic that acts as a kind of nautical fingerprint. It resembles the one clue a television detective would hold up before declaring the case closed. Of course, it isn't. The missing logbook ensures the debate is permanent, a self-perpetuating engine of academic conferences and competing national parks. No theory perfectly aligns every clue, every current, and every historical whisper. The argument is an artifact in itself, a strange heirloom of uncertainty. Historians will continue to feed it, poke it, and check its temperature, ensuring it never quite boils over and never cools. It's a scholarly crockpot. Anchor's arrival, aiming Arawak shores. To turn down the heat on that scholarly stew, you can't simply offer a sharper theory based on a 500-year-old book report. You need to graduate from literary analysis to the far messier business of marine forensics. Definitively planting a flag on the first landfall debate requires a body, or, in this case, a shipwreck. Finding a single lonely anchor from the 15th century would be historically useless, a hopeful paperweight rather than proof. Proving a specific ship went down is like proving a legendary party took place. A lone red plastic cup tells you nothing. Archaeologists demand the whole mess. They require a complete debris field, a crime scene frozen in amber and salt water. This means locating a cluster of Spanish anchors, specifically the Admiralty pattern issue, scattered like jacks from a god's own tabletop. You would need the ship's skeleton, its wrought iron fasteners, and perhaps its armaments, such as the stubby little cannons called lombards, the era's way of clearing its throat authoritatively. Once the carcass is located, the inquest begins. The ironwork matters, but the real tattletales are the pottery. Shards of simple Spanish olive jars or the humble honey-colored melado ware used for provisions are the indestructible storytellers of the sea. Unlike a friar summarizing a logbook years after the fact, a pot does not misremember. It is a ceramic time capsule stamped with a non-negotiable expiration date. If a single plate from the 16th or 17th century appears in the mix, the theory sinks. It must be a clean site, a party attended only by ghosts from 1492. Then comes the masterstroke, a piece of evidence so clever it feels like cheating: ballast. To keep their tippy caravels upright, mariners loaded the hulls with tons of worthless rock. By analyzing these stones, geologists can trace their mineralogical signatures back to the specific quarries near Palos, Spain, the port Columbus sailed from. Such a find acts as a geological DNA test, confirming the wreck's paternity and linking it directly to the admiral. The ultimate prize at this perfect site would be the specific anchor Columbus recorded losing at Guanahani as he searched for a safe harbor. Finding that would be less an archaeological discovery and more a historical mic drop. Yet even this underwater Pompeii would pale in comparison to the true Grail, the original logbook, the actual diario. Its discovery would render all other evidence secondary. We would no longer argue over what Las Casas meant. We would have the raw, unvarnished data. The day-by-day calculations, the secret corrections for compass drift, the unedited descriptions of the island's shape and reef, perhaps even a few crude sketches in the margins. It would be like finding the source code for the age of discovery. The search for the real Guanahani is a hunt for the X on the world's most important map. It is the final page in a story that historians desperately want to close, turning away from the ambiguous whispers of the past to point, finally, at a glorious, irrefutable pile of verified junk. Golden Greed, Pinta's plunder pursuit. Even if we miraculously dredged up that lost journal, with its pristine charts and anchor coordinates perfectly preserved, the story inside likely wouldn't be the clean epic of Jason seeking the Golden Fleece. It would read more like the minutes of a corporate retreat gone horribly wrong. The legend gives us a quest of gods and heroes. The reality, played out on October 12, 1492, was closer to a hostile acquisition bid led by a middle management team deeply out of its depth. On that morning, as the sun burned the Atlantic haze off the water, the admiral of the ocean sea dressed for the job. He donned a scarlet doublet, an outfit that screamed imperial authority, a bold choice for a man about to wade through the surf of a completely unknown island. Flanked by the Pinzón brothers, his vital partners and financiers, Columbus rode to the beach. Before the silent and presumably baffled Lucayan Taíno, he performed the requisite kneeling and thanking of God. Then he pivoted immediately to the real agenda, planting the royal standard and claiming this island, named San Salvador, plus any other rocks he might stumble upon, for the Spanish crown. This tableau of piety and patriotism lasted about as long as it takes a flamingo to lose its balance. The awe evaporated as the expedition's true purpose asserted itself. This was a startup with impatient investors back in Castile, and dividends were due. Columbus's gaze locked onto the small gold ornaments swaying from the Taínos' noses. The sacred quest for glory distilled instantly into a single, frantic, mime-acted question. Where did you get the shiny stuff? Pointing, gesticulating, and generally making a nuisance of himself, the admiral kicked off the New World's first and most obsessive scavenger hunt. Following the vague directions of the locals, who may have been pointing toward a real mine or simply in the direction they most wanted these loud strangers to go, the fleet spent weeks island hopping. They found lovely scenery and distinct cultures, but no vaults, no cities, and certainly no rivers paved with bullion. For Martin Alonso Pinzón, captain of the absurdly fast caravel Pinta, this leisure tour of fruitless searching was agonizing. He had a duty to the admiral, but he also had a crew to pay and a personal hunger to satisfy. The situation was primed for a catalyst, and it arrived in the form of a rumor about a place called Ballast. According to the Taíno, Ballast was an island to the southeast where gold was so common you could gather it on the beach by torchlight. For Pinzón, this was the jackpot he had sailed halfway across the world to claim. On November 21st, off the coast of Cuba, the captain's patience snapped. Without a word or signal to the flagship, Pinzón let his ambition take the helm. He broke formation. From the decks of the Niña and Santa Maria, Columbus could only watch with a mixture of fury and impotence as the sails of the Pinta became a white speck on the horizon. Pinzón had deserted the expedition, launching a brazen winner-take-all race for personal glory. He spent 6 weeks chasing the ghost of Ballast, only to find that the island of gold was a mirage. His raw greed had split the grand enterprise down the middle. The expedition, once a cohesive vessel, had fractured just weeks after arrival. Columbus's lost cask, Hispaniola's hidden history. While Captain Pinzón chased rumors of golden beaches over the horizon, the great enterprise of the Indies ran aground on a beach of its own. The expedition had already been fractured by greed. Now it was about to be broken by incompetence. With the Pinta gone, the fleet was reduced to the flagship and one small caravel, leaving Columbus exposed and undermanned just as his luck ran out. On the profoundly calm night of Christmas Eve, 1492, the exhausted admiral decided to sleep. His decision was reasonable, but his shipmaster's follow-up was not. In a violation of maritime law, the master handed the tiller of the Santa Maria to an inexperienced cabin boy so he, too, could rest. The ocean took immediate advantage of this negligence. A quiet, unseen current guided the flagship onto a hidden coral reef with the precision of a saboteur. The soft grind of wood against stone was followed by a sickening crunch. By the time the alarm was raised, the ship was caught, and the incoming swell began cracking her hull. Disaster forced an immediate pivot in the mission profile. With the flagship sinking off the coast of Hispaniola, Columbus shifted his objective from discover a new world to survive the night. With the aid of the local Taíno chief, Guacanagari, the crew salvaged most of the cargo, but the loss of the ship created a logistical crisis. The tiny Niña could not carry the combined crew back to Spain. Columbus transformed from explorer to reluctant property developer. He ordered his men to strip the bones of their dead flagship and use the timbers to construct a fort. Given the date of the catastrophe, he named the settlement La Navidad. He left 39 men behind in this outpost born of shipwreck, promising to return. It was a settlement founded not on strategy, but on lack of capacity. Now, commanding a fleet of one, Columbus limped eastward along the coast, a general without an army. His reunion with the rogue Pinta was not a matter of discipline, but of fortune. On January 6th, a sail appeared on the horizon. It was Pinzón, returning from his 6-week hunt for the mythical island of Ballast. His search for easy gold had failed. He approached Columbus with the 15th century equivalent of a "dog ate my homework" excuse, claiming a storm had blown him off course. Columbus, who logged every shift in the wind, knew it was a lie, but he needed the second ship more than he needed his pride. He accepted the fabrication and signaled for the return to Spain. If the outward journey had been monotonous, the return was pure terror. In mid-February, a hurricane of astonishing violence descended on the reunited fleet. The Niña and the Pinta were separated once more, and the flagship was nearly swallowed by the Atlantic. Convinced the expedition was about to vanish without a trace, Columbus performed an act of desperate historical foresight. He scrawled a summary of his discoveries on parchment, sealed it in a waxed cloth inside a wooden cask, and heaved it into the raging ocean. It was a final attempt to ensure his investors received their report, even if the CEO did not survive the meeting. The ocean accepted the flagship, but it refused the message. The cask was never found. Columbus would have to survive the storm and deliver the news himself. Ocean's Ordeal, Passage, Power, and Pinta's Plight. The storm eventually relented, but the drama had only entered its final act. The return journey became a calamity that would have suited the "this is fine" dog perfectly. After surviving a hurricane that had forced him to cast his logbook into the sea, Columbus limped his battered Niña toward the nearest land. He found the Portuguese-controlled Azores, which was about as much shelter as a rabbit finding refuge in a wolf's den. Being a Genoese captain in the employ of Spain, showing up in a Portuguese port acted as a declaration of either supreme confidence or supreme foolishness. Columbus, ever the optimist, sent half his exhausted, salt-crusted crew ashore to find a chapel and thank the Almighty for their survival. They were promptly ambushed and arrested. The local governor, João de Castanheira, was acting on standing orders from his king that essentially amounted to arrest anyone who looks vaguely foreign and has a boat. He suspected Columbus was a pirate, which, given the era and the general disposition of seafarers, was not an unreasonable starting assumption. From the deck of his tiny, storm-thrashed ship, Columbus engaged in what must be one of history's most audaciously lopsided standoffs. Gripping the Niña's rail, he threatened to bombard the entire port town if his men were not returned. This was a magnificent bluff, akin to a man threatening to burn down a castle with a single match and a head full of bluster. After 2 days of this maritime shouting match, the governor, perhaps realizing the paperwork involved in explaining a naval battle with a lone, half-sunk caravel was not worth the trouble, released the men. The message was clear. Columbus was not welcome here or anywhere else Portugal's flag flew. He set sail again, only for the Atlantic to deliver one final malevolent punch. Another storm, worse than the last, forced him not to Spain, but directly into the port of Lisbon. This was the geographic equivalent of being fired and then having your car break down in your ex-boss's driveway. He had to appear before his old rival, King John II, the very monarch who had dismissed his grand "sail west to get east pitch" as the ravings of a madman. Now the madman was back, claiming he had done it. The king, stewing in a royal broth of jealousy and regret, gave serious thought to having Columbus assassinated. His counselors, however, likely pointed out that murdering Spain's newest hero was a great way to start a very expensive and inconvenient war, so John II reluctantly let him go. On March 15, 1493, the Niña finally slipped into its home port of Palos de la Frontera, the town that had been forced to fund this ridiculous enterprise. As Columbus was hoisted onto the shoulders of the cheering locals, history delivered a twist so perfect a fiction writer would be embarrassed to invent it. Later that very same day, a second ship limped into the harbor. It was the Pinta, Martin Alonso Pinzón, who had snuck off 6 weeks prior to find his own gold, had also survived. He had landed in northern Spain weeks earlier and sent a letter directly to Ferdinand and Isabella, attempting to secure the credit for himself. After being coldly rebuffed by the monarchs, the sick and defeated captain sailed home, only to see his rival being showered with glory. Pinzón died days later, the final casualty of a partnership fueled by equal parts genius and greed. Standing on the dock, watching what was left of his fleet return in pieces, one wonders if Columbus felt the thrill of victory, or just the profound exhaustion of an enterprise that had cost so much. Crimson Shores, Conquest's cruel call. Columbus's hero's welcome in Palos was barely over, a celebration his rival Pinzón witnessed only from his deathbed, before the gears started grinding for a second act. This was not the scrappy, three-ship voyage into the unknown that defined 1492. This was the blockbuster sequel. Columbus departed in September 1493 with a staggering armada of 17 ships packed to the gunwales with over 1,200 men. The objective had shifted from exploration to a meticulously planned corporate buyout of an entire hemisphere. The mission statement was no longer, "Let's see what is out there," but "Let's own what is out there, convert its staff, and liquidate its assets." Among the passengers were soldiers, farmers, artisans, and priests, all the components needed to assemble a prefabricated piece of Spain and bolt it to the shores of the New World. Sailing with the confidence of a man who now actually knew where he was going, Columbus made a beeline for Hispaniola. He likely imagined the 39 men he had left behind at La Navidad would greet him on the beach, triumphantly holding up mountains of gold. Instead, he found the funereal silence of a burned-out fort. All 39 were dead. According to the local Taíno, the Spaniards had self-destructed in a spectacular display of greed and arrogance, fighting among themselves while terrorizing the natives and stealing food, gold, and women. It was as if a fraternity had been left in charge of a nation, and the Taíno chief Caonabo had finally responded with a definitive eviction notice. A different commander might have paused for sober reflection on the cultural friction his enterprise had created. Columbus, however, saw the massacre simply as a pretext. Whatever romantic notions he held of the Taíno as gentle innocents evaporated with the smoke rising from his ruined fort. His policy shifted from cautious diplomacy to outright conquest with the speed of a dropped sword. He abandoned the haunted ashes of La Navidad, sailed down the coast, and founded a new, more defensible town he named La Isabela. It was the first formal European city in the Americas, constructed less as a settlement and more as a military base. From this foothold, he launched a campaign of shock and awe. His men, armed with steel, crossbows, cavalry, and war dogs, were unleashed upon people whose primary weapon was the wooden club. It was a hostile dismantling of a society. He executed Taíno chiefs, including the formidable Caonabo, and implemented a tribute system of exquisite cruelty. Every Taíno over the age of 14 was ordered to produce a quota of gold dust every 3 months. Since the island possessed almost no gold to begin with, the demand was impossible to meet. Failure to pay was punished by the amputation of hands. It was a production quota that guaranteed default, a system designed not to gather wealth, but to justify enslavement. Hundreds were soon packed onto ships and sent to Spain, the first transatlantic slave shipment from the Americas, and a business model born of failure. We know these details not because Columbus kept a meticulous logbook, as he did on the first voyage. That document has conveniently vanished. Our knowledge comes from other sources, most notably a detailed account by the fleet's physician, Dr. Diego Alvarez Chanca. He acted as the expedition's embedded journalist, dutifully recording everything from encounters with the Lesser Antilles to clinical observations of the indigenous population. Through Chanca's dispassionate chronicle, we see the second voyage for what it was. And for the final historical record of my own journey, let it be known that in none of Dr. Chanca's writings is there a single mention of stopping by the Turks and Caicos. Columbus never returned to those shallow, reef-filled waters. His fixation had narrowed to exploiting the large land masses he had already found, a grim obsession for gold and control that had no time for minor archipelagos. Columbus's conquest, Lucayan Taíno's vanishing legacy. Columbus may have turned his back on the archipelago to chase larger prizes, but the machinery of conquest he set in motion did not. The Spanish Empire, having already turned Hispaniola from a society into a ledger sheet, soon fixed its gaze on what it dismissively termed the useless islands. This label was less a description of geography than a terrifying grimace of economic logic. The Bahamian archipelago and the Turks and Caicos offered no gold to fill royal coffers, so their value was reassigned to their inhabitants. The Lucayan Taíno, who had navigated these waters for centuries, were downgraded from potential converts to portable resources. The raids began in the opening years of the 1500s, motivated by a labor shortage in Hispaniola's mines and pearl fisheries. Thatch villages and dugout canoes offered little resistance to caravels and steel. Spanish chroniclers, whose enthusiasm for tallies often outpaced their commitment to truth, claimed 40,000 people were taken. Whether that figure is accurate or merely colonial braggadocio, the demographic collapse was absolute. By 1512, when Juan Ponce de León arrived, he found what was likely Grand Turk inhabited by exactly one elderly male. He charted it as Isla del Viejo, the island of the old man. While descriptively accurate, the name sounds less like a navigational term and more like a rumor whispered about the last recluse on a dead-end street. By 1520, the Lucayans were effectively gone. By 1540, the Turks and Caicos lay silent, their human history paused for over a century. The silence masked the complexity of the culture that had been erased. The Lucayans were the northernmost extension of the Taíno world, descendants of South American migrants who had arrived between 500 and 800 AD. They called themselves Lucu-Kairi, island people, and they had turned the archipelago into a specialized hub. Settlement sites on Grand Turk, like Coralie, date back to 900 AD, revealing a society deeply integrated into a regional economy. They exported salt from local pans, a commodity as vital as gold in a pre-refrigeration age, and processed queen conch at stations on tiny quays. They were skilled engineers of the sea, importing stone for tools and building large dugout canoes for inter-island commerce. This ingenuity survives now mostly in fragments behind glass. Palmetto ware pottery, tempered with crushed conch shell, remains distinctively local. In the National Museum, a wooden canoe paddle dating to around 1000 AD rests as physical proof of their seamanship. Even the language offers souvenirs. Words like hurricane and barbecue are linguistic ghosts of the Taíno tongue. While DNA studies suggest Lucayan ancestry lingers in the populations of Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, here the rupture was total. Standing in the Conch Bar caves today, the sense of interruption is acute. The air is cool, and the acoustics enhance the slightest sound, making it easy to imagine the Lucayan voices that once filled these cathedral-like spaces. Petroglyphs and artifacts found here mark it as a place of reverence, an underground record of belief. But the silence eventually returns, a heavy reminder of the arc that doomed them. From the fleets of Columbus's second voyage to the raids that emptied the useless islands, the history of this place serves as a persistent lesson. The age of exploration was also an age of extraction, and even paradise can be hollowed out when the wrong people come looking for treasure. Taíno Echoes, Turks and Caicos' unique history. With the Lucayan Taíno systematically scrubbed from existence, one naturally asks, then what? Did the islands simply sit there for a century and a half, hosting a long and very quiet crab convention? The historical beginning resembles a mixtape made by two strangers. The first song ends abruptly, followed by 150 years of hiss and static. When the next track finally fades in, the sound is the scraping of shovels against salt. The new arrivals appearing in the late 1600s were a motley crew of British colonists from Bermuda and the enslaved Africans they brought with them. They sought neither cities of gold nor the fountain of youth. Their colonial enterprise was farming seasoning. They landed to find the stage completely empty, the previous cast having been tragically and permanently fired. This offered a rare opportunity, building a nation from a standing start, moving into a house where the previous owners had been erased, leaving only pottery shards in the basement. Because of this clean break, searching for Taíno influence in modern Belonger culture is like hunting for Roman preference slang in a London coffee shop. It is simply not there. The distinct sizzle of ripsaw music, where a carpenter's saw is bent and scraped to create rhythm, traces its parentage to West Africa, not a Taíno canoe. The explosive colour of Junkanoo parades, the cadence of the local dialect, the very food on the plate, these speak to a heritage born of Africa and Bermuda, shaped by the British and baked into the salt pans. There was no cultural handoff, no passing of the torch. The torch had gone out, and someone else had to show up with a new box of matches. This creates a peculiar relationship with the past. The Taíno act not as ancestors in a familial sense. The Taíno are honoured here formally, transmitting from a scholarly distance. The Turks and Caicos National Museum holds the flame, displaying the palmetto-tempered pottery and shell jewellery that prove a sophisticated society once thrived. Spaces like the Conch Bar Caves remain protected parks, monuments to that lost first chapter. Cordoning off history behind velvet ropes might seem detached, but it is an act of honesty. It acknowledges that the Belonger story is not a continuation, but a beginning. It is a separate book, bound in the same sea and sand cover. That new book began its own epic journey of hardship and perseverance on August 1st, a date that marks not a landing but the long walk toward freedom known as emancipation. Chains claims, continents consequence. Walking the shoreline, my mind kept turning over that historical void in the Turks and Caicos, the clean break between the Taíno and everyone who came after. It is difficult to reconcile that silence with the tidy version of the Columbus story we often learn. We like to think the narrative ended with a parade in Spain, a neat conclusion to a daring adventure. But the curtain was just rising on the second act, a performance that veered from heroic epic to grim workplace drama, a tragedy whose consequences led directly to the very emptiness I was contemplating. The man himself orchestrated this turn. In 1498, Columbus set sail on a third voyage, a new quest for the king's elusive prophet. This time he steered south, perhaps hoping a change of latitude would change his luck. He stumbled upon Trinidad and then the coast of Venezuela, where the ocean tasted fresh. The immense outflow of the Orinoco River was a hydrological shout announcing that this was no mere island. He had found a continent, a vast landmass he dubbed an other world, a majestically vague phrasing for "I am profoundly lost," but on a much grander scale than previously imagined. He arrived back at his colonial headquarters on Hispaniola, expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, he found a mutiny. The settlers, having had quite enough of being governed by his brothers, were in open revolt. The enterprise had dissolved into a chaotic mess, like a group project where everyone hates the manager and the deadline was yesterday. Word of the mismanagement eventually drifted back to Spain, prompting the Crown to dispatch an auditor. Francisco de Bobadilla arrived with the severe authority of a man who doesn't waste time on exit interviews. He took one look at the situation, listened to the litany of complaints, and made a swift executive decision. In a move that sent shockwaves through the colonial administration, he had Columbus and his brothers arrested, clapped in irons, and shipped back to Spain like crates of defective merchandise. Being paraded through Spain in chains is generally considered a poor career move. Yet Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, after a brief and likely awkward meeting, let him go. They stripped him of his governorship, effectively demoting him from CEO to honorary consultant, but agreed to fund one final expedition. This fourth voyage was not an act of faith, it was an act of desperation. From 1502 to 1504, Columbus sailed the coast of Central America, from Honduras to Panama, on a grueling and fruitless hunt for a westward passage to Asia. The journey ended in catastrophe when his last two ships, their hulls chewed to splinters by shipworms, had to be beached on the coast of Jamaica. He and his crew were marooned for over a year, a miserable coda to a career of spectacular highs and calamitous lows. After his rescue, Columbus returned to Spain in 1504 a broken man. His patron, Queen Isabella, died soon after, leaving him to spend his final 2 years petitioning the king. He haunted the royal court, trying to regain his titles and lobbying for his contractually obligated share of the profits from a world he had fundamentally misunderstood. He died in 1506, still clinging to the belief that he had found the outskirts of Asia. He never grasped the colossal scale of his own discovery. While the admiral obsessed over mythical gold, his pilot, a man named Anton de Alaminos, had been quietly taking notes on the ocean currents. His charting of the Gulf Stream became the single most valuable asset of the entire enterprise, an invisible river in the sea that would power the Spanish Empire for centuries. Columbus's final years were not exactly a victory lap. The sunlit recipe for liquid turquoise. Processing the admiral's miseries, a career that ended with one voyage marooned on a reef and another in iron fetters, demanded a counterbalancing act of leisure. After a pilgrimage to a nearby beach shack for tacos that justified the sweltering walk, my son and I proceeded to the main event, a foray into the waters of Grace Bay. The beach itself is a magnificent fraud. It presents a shade of blue so electric, so aggressively beautiful, that it feels less like a product of nature and more like a design choice by a marketing committee with an unlimited budget for food coloring. Floating there, with my son paddling nearby, I dissected the mechanics of this spectacle. The impossible color of the Turks and Caicos is not magic. It is a performance by 3 co-conspirators. First, the water is shockingly pure, lacking the river silt that clouds lesser oceans. Sunlight penetrates deep, where the water absorbs the lazy reds and yellows, leaving only the energetic blue light to bounce around. Second, the seabed is brilliant white sand, the pulverized remains of eons of coral and shell. This serves as a submerged mirror. The blue light dives, hits this dazzling floor, and fires back toward the surface with doubled intensity. Finally, the Caicos bank is incredibly shallow for miles. This allows the sunlit mirror effect to play out on a massive scale, creating the hallucinatory turquoise. Far out on the horizon, a sharp line marks the end of the show. The color plunges to a deep navy blue at the wall, where the shallow bank gives way and the seafloor drops thousands of feet into the Atlantic abyss. The clarity that creates the color also exposed the local fauna, consisting mostly of a few nervous fish. There is no bustling coral reef here to draw crowds of snorkelers. Instead, the transparency granted an excellent view of the approaching speedboats. They materialized on the horizon and zipped toward the swimming area with the cheerful indifference of a meteor. They wove through floaters and swimmers as if we were merely decorative buoys in a private slalom course. It remains a mystery how the beach is not littered with flattened tourists. I have begun to codify this observation during tours of former British colonies. There appears to be a prevailing belief that the coastline is a lawless frontier, a sort of aquatic Wild West where posted regulations are merely gentle suggestions. It is a unique expression of liberty, the inalienable right to be clipped by a V8 engine while enjoying a swim. Enforcement of any kind seems to have been left on a ship back to England a few centuries ago, like a forgotten crate of tea. Turk's tidings, tranquil trysts, costly comforts. Narrowly avoiding a starring role in a cautionary tale about speedboat etiquette, a retreat to the geometric certainty of a swimming pool seemed wise. This particular aquatic sanctuary possessed a feature of stunning ingenuity, a polycarbonate window, a porthole to the submerged world. I spent 10 minutes peering through this marvel of engineering, conducting a solemn scientific observation of human legs. It was a window into the soul of the resort, or at least into the lower halves of its patrons. Here, in the chlorinated safety of the pool, the chaos of the open water, that unregulated demolition derby I'd witnessed earlier, felt a civilized world away. As the sun began a long theatrical decline, our mission turned from poolside surveillance to evening sustenance. The destination was preordained, a site of pilgrimage for those who believe relaxation is best performed for an audience. The resort's heavily Instagrammed Infinity Bar. It is famous for a single dramatic claim, the kind of boast that sounds impressive until you think about it for more than 3 seconds. It is, allegedly, the longest bar in the Caribbean. 90 feet of polished stone stretch from the restaurant toward the sea, designed to trick the eye into thinking the bar dissolves into the ocean. It is a masterwork of perspective, a long, thin monument built on land once deemed useless, now dedicated to the very useful act of selling expensive cocktails. My mind, perhaps suffering from mild sunstroke, immediately questioned the functional benefits. Does a longer bar mean faster service? Or is it like a highway where the extra lanes just invite more traffic, creating a 90-foot-long traffic jam of daiquiri orders? This establishment is credited with elevating Grace Bay from simple beach casual to a state of sophisticated chic. Sitting there, watching the sky bleed orange, it was easy to see how. The bar top, a field of white marbled with streaks of rust, reflected the sunset like a piece of abstract art. The atmosphere was one of meticulously curated serenity. We settled in for dinner, and the food was, without question, very good. The bill, when it arrived, was a document of such breathtaking financial ambition that it felt less like a receipt and more like a ransom note. This was becoming a familiar theme, a recurring episode in a tragicomedy titled "My Wallet Goes on Vacation." And so the day concluded, a period of calm defined not by heroic action but by its deliberate absence. It was an exercise in luxurious inertia. In hindsight, I see I failed to appreciate the profundity of the ritual. The objective was not merely to eat and drink, but to participate in a ceremonial exchange of currency for tranquility, a rite of passage for the leisure class. My preoccupation with the numerical figures on the final bill was a clear sign of my unsuitability for this sacrament. I was like an anthropologist at a sacred feast, clumsily trying to calculate the caloric content of the offering instead of simply embracing its significance. The entire performance, from the endless bar to the infinite ocean, was a perfectly calibrated experience, and I, the humble observer, had clearly missed the point by checking the price tag. From Columbus's tragic legacy to the quiet persistence of tiny geckos hiding in leaf litter, sometimes the most profound discoveries happen when we abandon our original plans entirely. Speaking of unexpected encounters, next week we're trading historical mysteries for biological ones as we hunt for some of the Caribbean's most elusive reptiles, including one of the world's smallest vertebrates that's practically invisible even when you know exactly where to look. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conch and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know what's lurking just beneath your feet.